Thanks to Card Market for sponsoring this video. Hi, I'm Mars from StrataGames, and today I have a topic that I want to talk about that is ideally going to help people become a little bit better players. Talking about a situation that we see a lot in Pauper, but really Magic as a whole. You can apply this to a lot of different formats. And that is what I'm calling the action stalemate. There could definitely be a better term for this, I'm not exactly sure, but you'll know exactly what I'm talking about with this example. This comes up a lot in Pauper when you are playing cards like Blood Fountain, and your opponent has a card like Nihil Spellbomb. Both of these cards sit on the field, and with the Blood Fountain you can pay 4 mana to try to recur 2 creatures from your graveyard to your hand, but if your opponent has a Spellbomb, they can crack that Spellbomb in response to your Blood Fountain activation, exiling your graveyard, meaning you get nothing. Which means if you activate the Blood Fountain first, the person who has the Spellbomb is going to come out on top. However, if your opponent wants to crack their Spellbomb proactively, maybe just to draw a card off of the trigger that they get, assuming you have 4 mana available, you could then activate your Blood Fountain in response, getting your creatures from your graveyard, meaning the person who activated the Spellbomb first is going to lose to the person who activated the Blood Fountain. Lose this interaction, that is, not necessarily the game as a whole. And this is the action stalemate that I mentioned. The first person to take an action here is going to lose this battle. And what this leads to is both players probably just passing, focusing on other aspects of gameplay while these just sit on the field. Now this stalemate is made possible because you're both aware of what's happening. Let's move myself up here so you can see, but both of these cards are face up on the battlefield, so you're both aware that you're locked in this conflict, and thus you both are probably aware the first person to act will lose this conflict as well. Now these are just 2 cards that I'm using as examples, but you could swap a whole bunch of different cards in here, but they could change up the interaction a little bit. If instead of a Blood Fountain, you are holding up a Reaping the Graves in your hand, waiting for an opportunity to cast it to recur a bunch of your creatures, then you know you have this action stalemate with your opponent. If they have a Spellbomb on board and you try to cast the Reaping, they're going to crack the Spellbomb, exile your graveyard, and you're going to lose that interaction. But because the Reaping the Graves in your hand is face down to your opponent, they don't know that you have it. They don't actually know you're locked in this stalemate. They might crack their Spellbomb proactively in order to draw a card, or to a Crookland Shaman, or any number of other things, which could pave the way for you to cast your Reaping the Graves, because they didn't realize that they were locked in this and were supposed to hold the Spellbomb up. From your perspective, not a lot changes. You cannot be the first one to act, but since they don't know they're supposed to hold up the Spellbomb, they might make a mistake here. This distinction between face down and face up cards is important because a Blood Fountain is face up only if it's on the battlefield. Obviously, if it's in your hand and your opponent doesn't know about it, that means it's face down. Now, while you can't activate the Blood Fountain from your hand, by keeping it in your hand, your opponent doesn't know you have a way to recur creatures from their graveyard, and they might crack their Spellbomb just to draw a card, even if you don't have anything in your graveyard that's worth getting back. By holding the Blood Fountain in our hand, we're making it so our opponent doesn't realize they need to hold that Spellbomb. So if they crack it and then a few creatures die throughout the next few turns, we can later on slam the Blood Fountain, crack it right away to get back our creatures. Whereas if we just play the Blood Fountain out early, even before creatures have died, our opponent's going to do everything they can to hold onto that Spellbomb until it's relevant. This right here is a good reason why you should try to hold your Blood Fountains in hand until you're going to use them, unless of course you need them for other things like affinity count or sacrificing artifacts. But similarly, if we hold our Blood Fountain in our hand, our opponent, who might have a Thraben Charm in hand, might not leave up mana for that Thraben Charm every single turn. If we cast a Blood Fountain, they're likely to hold up charms so that we don't get got by that Blood Fountain, but if we hold Blood Fountain in hand until we have the 5 mana that we want to use right away, our opponent may tap out, not holding up mana for that Thraben Charm. So there's a lot of benefit to holding your Blood Fountain, or really any of these face-up cards that your opponent would be aware of that are going to try to get creatures or any cards back from your graveyard. Holding them for the time when you actually want to use them is really important to think about. Unless you've duressed them or anything like that, this is a face-down card to you. You don't know for sure that your opponent has a Thraben Charm in hand. They don't know you have the Reaping the Graves. Now, there are indications of this, of course. If they've left up 2 mana for the last several turns, at least one of which is white, you could probably assume they might have a Thraben Charm. And if you've been leaving up 3 mana pretty conspicuously, they might assume you have something like a Reaping the Graves as well. But without a way to look at your opponent's hand, there's no 100% confirmation. So in a pinch, if you're really struggling, you might cast the Reaping the Graves first, just hoping that they don't have the Thraben Charm if you're a little bit desperate. I would say if you're not desperate, you probably still don't want to fall into this trap, because this is a potential action stalemate. You're not 100% sure if that is the case, but leaving up the mana is a good indication it might be. These cards, again, can be just about anything. It could be a Pulse of Marasa instead of a Reaping the Graves. Similarly, since that's in hand, it's also a face-down card. They could have a Fairy Macabre. These obviously all have different effects, but they generally don't change the principle. All these cards have also been about the graveyard, but we have a lot of other stalemates that can come up. If you have a 1 mana instant you're looking to cast, but your opponent is playing a Fairies deck, you can reasonably assume sometimes they might have a spell stutter sprite up. If you cast your Brainstorm, they'll probably cast their spell stutter sprite to counter it, coming out on top because they got that 1-for-1, getting your Brainstorm out, but they also get to keep the spell stutter sprite, so it's really a 2-for-1. Whereas if they just cast their spell stutter sprite, maybe because they want to get it down and start ninja-ing with it, they allow you to resolve your Brainstorm. Now that's not so detrimental that they might not be willing to do that, but as long as both of you are holding your cards up, you know the first person to act is probably going to be the one that gets got here. Another classic example of this is Lightning Bolt, or really any burn spell, and a Weather the Storm. If you're down to 3 life and your opponent is casting a Lightning Bolt at you, you can cast a Weather the Storm in response, gaining enough life to survive. But if you're at 3 life and they pass the turn, and on your end step you cast a Weather the Storm to gain a bunch of life, and then in response they cast the Lightning Bolt, they're going to come out on top, winning that game. This is definitely one of the highest stakes of these action stalemates, because the game literally could be decided by you casting a Weather the Storm prematurely. So it's really important in this situation, unless you're willing to potentially take the loss, to save the weather for casting it after their Lightning Bolts. Another example of this is if you have a go-wide strategy like White Weenie, and you have a Guardian's Pledge that you want to cast, pumping your 1/1s and 2/2s enough to deal your opponent lethal damage. But if they have a Breath Weapon in response to the Guardian's Pledge, they essentially counter the pledge and kill your entire board. But if you just attack first and they Breath Weapon and you have the Guardian's Pledge, that'll keep all of your creatures alive, as well as pumping them up, being able to deal tons and tons of damage, maybe even winning the game on the spot. So there are lots of different examples of this action stalemate, and now that I've explained what that is, I have 5 tips to help you come on top when you find yourself in one of these stalemates. The first tip is basically what I've alluded to. The whole premise of this is don't act first. You need to be patient. If you just think, well, I might as well just crack my Blood Fountain, I have this 4 mana up and available, might as well just use it and get it out of the way, force them to use their Spellbomb. Their Spellbomb is in their deck to counter your Blood Fountain. They're not upset about using a Nihil Spellbomb to counter this Blood Fountain activation, especially if they get to draw a card too. That's why they put it in their deck. You've allowed them to do exactly what they wanted to, and your Blood Fountain was pretty much completely useless. And you might think, well, if they have the Spellbomb, it doesn't matter if we crack the Blood Fountain because they're going to have it at some point anyway. But the next 4 tips are all about how to deal with them having a Spellbomb, or any card to counter your card. I understand being impatient, trying to use your mana, all those things, but you got to remember, in this example, cracking a Blood Fountain, you get nothing by losing the stalemate. It's much better for you to just both have your cards on board, force them to not be able to use their card, because we might be able to find a way to get around it later. For example, tip 2 is that you want to wait for your openings. Let's flip things here and say you're the one with the Spellbomb, your opponent has a Blood Fountain. 4 mana is a lot to hold up to activate Blood Fountain, so your opponent might not hold it up every single turn. Maybe they tap out for Chrysalis or any number of other things. If you want to get out of the stalemate, having the Spellbomb, this gives you a window to crack your Spellbomb, exiling their graveyard. This can be good if they have other cards in their graveyard you want to exile, or if you just really need to draw the card off the Spellbomb. This is a nice way to exit the stalemate in a way that doesn't give your opponent an advantage, but it's not always the best to do because you got to remember they still have that Blood Fountain. And if the game goes longer, more creatures will probably die, and eventually they can recur them with the fountain. Whereas if you leave that Spellbomb on board, even later with many creatures dying, you'll still have an answer to it. Now, if your opponent has the Spellbomb, it's really hard for you to find an opening because Spellbomb doesn't cost any mana to do. So unless they like tap it to improvise a card or something, Spellbomb's almost always going to be active. Now, you could crack your Blood Fountain when they're tapped out and thus can't get a card from the Spellbomb. That nerfs their card a little bit, but they'll still be able to exile your graveyard. But if your opponent is holding up a Relic of Progenitus instead, Relic costs a mana to crack and exile everything. So maybe they tap out at one point. They probably will try to avoid doing this, but if they do tap out, this would allow you to activate your Blood Fountain, getting back your creatures. So every turn you probably want to reevaluate the stalemate. Can you pull the ripcord and eject from it? Has your opponent tapped out? Because also if they're holding up a Thraben Charm, we know that costs 2 mana, so if they ever tap below 2 mana, that would allow you to crack the Blood Fountain. There's a lot of little things like that to look for. So rather than just cracking the Blood Fountain at a random time, so look for an opening where your opponent has tapped out of the ability to counter you. The third tip is you can crack the stalemate, giving your opponent the ability to win that interaction if you're baiting for something else, if this allows you to win some other greater interaction. So maybe you crack your Spellbomb, forcing them to Blood Fountain back their creatures, but tapping them out. Maybe this gives you the ability to Krark Toxin combo while your opponent has a couple Chrysalis out. Now that they're tapped out, they can't have any cast downs or anything like that to interact with you. You wipe the board, and maybe that puts you in a far better spot. Or a big example of this is maybe you do end up casting your Brainstorm or whatever it is you're trying to dodge a spell stutter for, and then if they do cast the spell stutter on it, that means they don't have that counter spell for anything else, or maybe they even tap out entirely, meaning they're not holding up counter magic, and you can resolve something else entirely. I will say in this case, if you have a lot of other mana, they're probably not going to counter a Brainstorm, but say you're playing something like Black Sack, casting one creature like an Izumi Linkbreaker that your opponent can cast with a spell stutter to get a Carrion Feeder through is absolutely a great play that you can make. But you don't just want to cast a 1-drop, letting your opponent spell stutter it if you don't have something else to play. So it's okay to sacrifice the stalemate interaction as long as that is contributing to you winning something greater. The fourth tip here is just to try to find more answers. Usually this is redundancies that allows you to continue trying to do the thing that you're trying to do. So if you have a blood fountain and your opponent has a Spellbomb, but then you draw a Pulse of Marasa, you now have 2 ways to get creatures back from your graveyard. Your opponent only has 1 way to exile your graveyard. So because blood fountain is face up, as is Spellbomb, you can crack your blood fountain to try to get back 2 creatures. They crack their Spellbomb, and then in response, you can take them by surprise and Pulse of Marasa back 1 creature. This is the best way to blindside them, as Pulse of Marasa is face down and they're not going to necessarily anticipate it. However, you could do things a little bit differently. They already know about the blood fountain, so if you Pulse of Marasa first, trying to get back 1 creature, they could crack the Spellbomb, trying to exile the card you're targeting with Pulse of Marasa, but they know then that the blood fountain is something you could activate and that you will come out on top getting back 2 creatures there. In that scenario, most times I think they probably won't crack the Spellbomb and you'll simply be able to resolve your Pulse of Marasa, gaining 6 life, returning 1 creature from your graveyard to your hand, but this won't exit the stalemate. Going forward, you'll still both have your artifacts fighting over the graveyard here. So depending on whether you want to break that stalemate or not, either way you probably have a good chance of resolving a Pulse of Marasa here. It just depends on whether you want to make them lose that Spellbomb for maybe later considerations. Tip number 5 is you want to try to force your opponent to be the first one to act. With our example of Brainstorm and Spellstutter Sprite, if you know your opponent has the sprite, maybe you duressed them earlier, and again, Brainstorm can be just about anything, you both have this card set aside in your hand that you're waiting on the other one to cast first, but Spellstutter Sprite has more utility than just being a counterspell, it's also a creature. So if you have, say, a Tolarian Terror and you've gotten them down to 5 life, and you're attacking in with it, and they have no other creatures, they're going to be forced to cast that Spellstutter Sprite just to block the Terror so they don't die for the turn. If you cast your Brainstorm pre-combat, letting them Spellstutter Sprite it, and then you go to attack, they can also block, getting both sides of the utility of Sprite, whereas if you attack first, you force them to cast it, and then you can resolve your Brainstorm after. I actually just had a fun example of forcing my opponent to act first. I was playing Esper Affinity, and my opponent was on Gardens. I had a Blood Fountain on board, and they had a Fairy Macabre that I had seen from a Duress previously, so I knew they had it, and I wasn't going to crack my Blood Fountain anytime soon. They got down to about 3 cards in hand, and I had sandbagged 2 Glinthawks because I had no artifacts I wanted to pick up with it, and then I finally top-decked a Refurbished Familiar. So I cast the Refurb, making them discard a card, then I Glinthawked the Refurb back to hand, cast it again, making them discard a card, Glinthawked it again, cast it a 3rd time, and their last card in hand was this Fairy Macabre. Now they have to discard it or they have to use it first. They decided to discard it to exile 2 creatures from my graveyard that they thought I wanted, but I had the mana then with the Blood Fountain to sacrifice and get those 2 creatures back to my hand. This is a great example of this tip 5, forcing your opponent to act, because I didn't need another Blood Fountain or another way to recur creatures or anything like that. I just made it so that they had to act first, and that made me come out on top. I had probably 10 turns when I knew they had this Fairy Macabre where I didn't crack the Blood Fountain, where if I had just said, screw it, let's go for it, knowing they have the Macabre, I would have lost those creatures in the graveyard for no value. Another great example of this is if we're the player with a Spellbomb and our opponent has a Blood Fountain, if we find a Bojuka Bog, which is a sorcery speed way to exile their graveyard, we play that, targeting them, forcing them to use their Blood Fountain now. This fits under both forcing our opponent to act and finding more answers, but it's still a great example. Bojuka Bog forces them to use the Blood Fountain now or lose all the creatures in their graveyard. They go to sacrifice to bring them back, and then we Spellbomb them on top of it. I'm sure there's many more examples of this throughout the game, and probably a lot more that I could add to this, but I wanted to keep this succinct and just have a nice little video about it. Hopefully this was helpful and can help improve your games in the future. Thanks so much for watching, and thanks to my $10 and up monthly supporters like Howard Granger, JD NPX, Howkaz, Cody Cowell, Sty, Benedict, and DJ Vinyl. I really appreciate the support, and I will see you all next time.